Gaffney is the president of the Center for Security Policy, where Cheney spoke last night and was honored along with his chief of staff, Scooter Libby. And Ron Reagan's with Air America Radio right now. Good morning, Frank.
Cheney has every right to express his opinion about anything he wants to. But I have to say, of all the people on the face of the earth who lack credibility on this issue, Dick Cheney would have to be at the top of the list. He has gotten virtually everything wrong in terms of American warfighting over the last 8 years, the 8 years that he was in office. Iraq, threat to the United States? No, it wasn't. Involved with 9/11? No, Saddam Hussein wasn't. Did they harbor WMD? No, they didn't. Could we ignore Afghanistan for years while we pursued this war in Iraq? No, apparently we couldn't afford to do that. Our own generals are now saying it's in a downward spiral. So Dick Cheney has zero credibility on this issue.
Let me go to Frank. First of all, I opened the show tonight by talking about this case before the courts now. A judge is about to rule, apparently, that the testimony, by much of it, by Dick Cheney in defending his chief of staff, both of whom, by the way, you honored last night. I want to ask you why you honored a guy who's a felon, a convicted perjurer and obstructor of justice, and Dick Cheney. You said that his chief of staff was responsible for service before self. You know, that strikes me as a guy who took the bullet for Cheney. Your thoughts? Why are you honoring a guy for protecting the boss in this regard?
We honored Scooter Libby as well as Dick Cheney and
Why?
a whole gaggle of guys who served their country with great distinction, and that is not perhaps one of the things that one would recognize him for, but I think the rest of his service deserved that kind of
But why would you put black ties on, all dress up, and give awards to these people? I don't get it. The president wouldn't pardon him. George W. Bush didn't think he was innocent.
I can't justify the president's decision.
Do you think he was?
I have my thoughts on it, and my general feeling is that he got a raw deal. Yeah.
That he was innocent.
I think that
innocent and he wasn't covering for the vice president.
We know who told.
No, I'm talking about obstruction of justice and perjury.
We know who told the press about this instance, and I don't think it was.
Okay, it just seems odd that these guys. It just seems odd you guys keep giving awards on the right to anybody you like.
I think it's odd, but
well, I mean, getting on black tie and bringing up a convicted felon and saying, "Here's another trophy."
In a lot of different ways.
Anyway, do you think? Let me ask you a question. Should we get the whole story on that case ever, what the vice president's role was? Would you like to see his testimony made public? The judge apparently is going to rule in that direction.
I personally am in favor of transparency.
Great. Okay.
Whether it's
Let me ask you about
the United States or the vice president.
The vice president won't leave town. There's a tradition that you leave town after you leave office, but he sticks around like Pearl Mesta. He's like holding salons and all. Why does he accuse this president of dithering when the president is clearly trying to make the right decision? What's wrong with deliberation? Wouldn't a little deliberation have been a good thing before we sent all those guys to their death in Iraq? Thinking a little bit before you act? Your thoughts?
I think that that's a mischaracterization of what happened in Iraq, and I think it's a mischaracterization of what's happening
What's dithering mean?
Dithering means that you are signaling 6 months after you adopted a strategy with much fanfare, you appointed a general to go implement that strategy. You said at the time and repeatedly you were going to resource it properly, that you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what the strategy is. You don't know what resources it requires, and you're not sure how soon you'll be able to get it done.
Suppose new intel came in.
In the meantime,
new intel that Karzai didn't win the election, he's not our leader.
Didn't have anything to do with the strategy. These guys made a strategy 6 months ago. But here's the point, Chris. What we're watching is an unraveling that is happening in no small measure because the guys on the ground there, our guys perhaps, but certainly the bad guys, and a lot of Afghans in between, are saying, we're not sure they're going to be here. Right. And people adjust accordingly, and that's not good for our interest if this is a war of necessity, as the president has said.
Ron, you get in here because I read the speech. I read the vice president's speech, and I thought it was a very strong case for the need for us to be in there and defend the Afghan people against Taliban, the Taliban forces who are coming back. The problem with his argument, it never really explains how we can ever leave. It's basically putting cement into a tree that's falling down, into the hole in the tree, putting cement into a dying tree, and somehow saying, well, we can't be this cement, though. We can't stay there forever. Eventually, we're going to have to come out of that tree, and the tree is going to fall down. So I don't get this strategy of being the Afghan Defense Force, which is what he seems to be recommending here.
I don't get it either, and you might want to ask Dick Cheney, and maybe Frank can the next time he sees him, why, if putting more troops into Afghanistan is so important, Dick Cheney refused to do so when he was in office, and George Bush, his nominal boss, refused to do so. If we need more forces in Afghanistan, Afghanistan to protect the Afghan people, et cetera, and fight the Taliban. Why was he so reluctant to do that in the first place? And why was he so reluctant to not to get the job done in Afghanistan in the first place, too? Why divert our attention to Iraq, a war that didn't need to be fought because Iraq posed no danger to the United States? Why do that and ignore Afghanistan? Again, the man has no credibility. And just one last point on Scooter Libby and Dick Cheney being honored last night by Frank's group. It's one thing to honor a convicted felon. It's another thing to honor an unindicted war criminal, and that is exactly what Dick Cheney is. He was as instrumental as anybody in the administration in pushing the torture policy that humiliated this nation in front of the world. So I guess you get a big prize for that, too.
Well, look, where do I begin? Iraq was a war of necessity. We were dealing with a terrorist sponsoring regime that had access to weapons of mass destruction. We can debate that endlessly if you'd like.
Now it's access.
Yeah.
I thought they had weapons of mass destruction.
They did have weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, the ones that we gave them in the 80s?
Ron,
the one that we gave them in the 80s?
Let me interrupt just for a second. Retired General Paul Eden of the National Security Network today issued this response to Vice President Cheney's remarks last night. We've been talking about it. The record is clear. Dick Cheney and the Bush administration were incompetent war fighters. They ignored Afghanistan for 7 years with a crude approach to counterinsurgency warfare, best illustrated by 1, denying it, 2, ignoring it, 3, bombing it. While our intelligence agencies called the region the greatest threat to America, the Bush White House under-resourced our military efforts, shifted attention to Iraq, and failed to bring to justice the masterminds of September 11th. So we didn't catch...
Well, I'm not a mind reader, of course. I can't tell you exactly what President Obama is thinking, but I think, as you brought up before, we've got a different situation now. You now have an illegitimate government in Afghanistan. Well, if it was ever legitimate, but the election was a fraud. So we're now dealing with a government that the Afghan people doesn't believe in. Are we going to make that government our allies in order to defend those very same Afghan people? That requires a little more thought.
Ron, you have got a sanctimony factor here that is extraordinary. I hope you're willing to take responsibility for what comes next.
Okay.
I would hope, Frank, I would hope that Dick Cheney would take responsibility for what he has done in the past.
I know. Attack. If indeed we fail,
well, Frank, when it's appropriate, I will.
Okay, let me tell you the trouble.
Part responsible for the dithering and the failure.
I'm not responsible. Dick Cheney was during his 8 years.
And we didn't lose Afghanistan during his 8 years.
Let me tell you
we
something.
didn't lose
yes, you did. I beg to differ, Frank.
This is the old.
Not after 9/11.
The old canard. Lose Afghanistan.
Frank, you're a nice guy, but you do yourself no credit by defending a man like Dick Cheney.
Let me get one at a time.
We don't own Afghanistan. Every time you go in and occupy a country, you're eventually going to have to leave. That's my problem with occupation as a means of defending the United States. Once you occupy a country, eventually you have to leave, unless you say you're going to stay there indefinitely.
Or unless you create conditions in which you can stay.
We've been there 8 years.
Peacefully,
what have we done?
As we are in Germany and in Japan today.
There were no American soldiers killed after VA Day, and you know it.
And there were people killed after VA Day, as a matter of fact. There were Americans killed. Yes, indeed.
Not in Germany.
Yes, indeed. There were. Chris, the point is,
when did this happen?
We had all kinds of operations that were going on by revanchist groups that were still trying to kill Americans and others. Was it large numbers?
I went back and checked
this.
There was no activities after 45.
There certainly were activities. Was it a mass problem? No. Has it been a problem since? No. And that's what ideally we would like to have in places like Iraq and Afghanistan.
How long do you want Americans to be the gendarmes?
I don't want them to be the gendarmes at all. I want them to be part of a stable government that denies the Taliban and denies the
permanent occupation
10, 20, 30 years, that's all.
Being present to support them,
just
as we've done in Japan.
At least you're open about it.
Just as we've done in Japan and Germany. No American today is insisting that those forces
this is what I've heard the neocons want: a permanent U.S. military establishment in the Middle East. That's what you want.
It's not in Afghanistan.
Hegemony in the Middle East.
That's not in the Middle East.
Iraq,
That's not in the Middle East. I would personally like to have Americans forward deployed because I think we wind up saving ourselves a lot of grief.
The way they look at it is an occupation force. The way you use the term.
If we have in fact helped them survive what the Taliban is trying to do to them, I think they will be grateful to have us there, not regarding us as an occupation force that must be expelled.
So if you had a vote, right now, let me ask you a question, because I don't know the answer. Best questions, right? If you had a vote in Afghanistan among the people who are not Taliban right now, would they vote for us to stay?
I think rather than have the
Would
Taliban.
they vote for us to stay?
Rather than have the Taliban take over the
that's
country.
different.
They would. It isn't different. It's exactly the answer, Chris. You said you didn't know what the answer is.
Well,
that is exactly
they would
the
vote
answer.
for the American
they would
army to
rather
stay
not be ruled by the Taliban again. And would you? Would you, Ron? Would you want to be ruled by the Taliban?
That wasn't why we went into Afghanistan in the first place, Frank.
That it will
that
dominate
wasn't the
rest
way.
of the world?
That was not why we went into Afghanistan.
Ask yourself this: would you want the Taliban to be victorious in Afghanistan? Because believe me,
what does that even mean, Frank? What does that even
not just the Taliban,
Frank?
but
What you're saying
Islamists
is utterly
worldwide will be emboldened
Frank.
and empowered
it is a
by
red
our
herring.
defeat there.
It is a
if
red
that's
herring
what you're
because you
recommending,
have
Ron,
no argument.
You do have to take
you
responsibility.
Gentlemen,
Frank.
one of the great ironies of American politics is the group in this country.
Your father would be ashamed of you.
That's not fair. The
Frank,
it is.
You better watch your mouth
Okay.
about that, Frank.
The group in this country.